Hi, and welcome to this mini lecture on Kundalini Shakti. What is it? And really a bit of a brief history in time about this idea of Kundalini and how we can understand it as modern day yogis from different contexts. My name is Cyan Pascal. I am the founder of the Light Collective. We're an online yoga school. And if you're interested in more of these satsangs, especially around classical tantric philosophy, or even practices that are breath-related, feminine-centric Shakti practices, then I highly recommend you click subscribe below. We really do our best to kind of regularly post free content. We're usually super busy doing yoga teacher trainings and our online studio, but we like to write blog posts, and we like to also disseminate some of this information for free because we think it's really important, because there is so much misinformation out there in the world of yoga. And this isn't necessarily anyone's fault. It's because access to the tantric texts has been really limited until now. And so as I am personally receiving more information from Sanskrit scholars who are specifically doing work on the classical tantric texts, I'm having to change, adjust, and shift all of the things that I've learned. And one of the main things that around my teachings that I've had to shift in order to align with more accurate information that comes from the tantric texts is the idea of Kundalini. So first of all, I was saying it wrong. I was saying Kundalini. I mean, my Australian accent obviously doesn't help, but even just trying to change the way I say the word Kundalini. Let's start from where we are now with Kundalini and move back in time and eventually get back to the classical history and meaning of it. Because if we work the other way around, you might think that the modern way is the correct way. So first of all, let's discuss this term Kundalini Yoga. Now, first of all, this is more of a brand name of yoga. And let's get into that definition first, because Kundalini doesn't necessarily correlate to Kundalini yoga as you might practice it at a school, a yoga school somewhere. This is a style of yoga created by a man called Yogi Bhajan, and he was an Indian Sikh who moved to the States and started to teach this style of yoga, and he called it Kundalini. So it doesn't actually relate to anything necessarily to do with the power of Kundalini, except that as part of it, he said you could access Kundalini through this work. I highly recommend, if you want to look a little more deeply into Yogi Bhajan, type in Kundalini yoga scandal or Kundalini or Yogi Bhajan and abuse or allegations into Google. You'll get some interesting articles. And there's also a great article from Maharaj to Mahan Tantrik, the construction of Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini yoga by somebody called Philippe Deslipe. And then you can start to make up your own mind about that particular school of yoga. So first of all, tick Kundalini yoga brand name, just like, I don't know, there are other brand names of yoga like that utilize Sanskrit words, such as the crew from the States who do this other style of yoga. I've totally lost it. Anyway, it'll come to me later. Anyway, it's just a brand, basically, of yoga. Let's go back a little bit in history and in the idea and psychology of Kundalini. If you were to go online and look up what is Kundalini, there would be a lot of articles that describe it as being a power stuck in the base of the spine. So this incredible force that is lying latent in the base of the spine, and through practices like Kriya Yoga, you can release the power and it rises up through the body, moving through the chakras to allow for a state of awakening to happen. Now, there are two reasons why this idea is popular now. One comes from the Hatha yogic texts. So the Hatha yogic texts were in some ways drawing upon the ancient Tantric tradition, but in other ways were actively suppressing and subverting the Tantric lineage as well. So this is something important to remember, that they weren't always fully honoring the Tantric tradition. There was also, in certain circles, an idea that there was a subversion of the Tantric lineage in Hatha, and there was a sense that they were actively not wanting it to continue. So they were part of the suppression of Tantric yoga. And so within the Hatha corpus of texts, there is a different view of Kundalini. And this differing view of Kundalini was then mistranslated by an author who went by the name Arthur Avalon, but whose real name was Sir John Woodruff. And he found a late Hatha text called the Shat Chakra Nirupana, and he translated it into a book called The Serpent Power, The Secrets of Tantric and Shaktic Yoga. That's what he called it. That sounds very appealing, right? If you're a bit of a yogi and into this kind of stuff, you'd be like, ooh. And people were. Now, the issue with this book was, first of all, it wasn't a Tantric text that he was drawing upon. It was a Hatha text that he was drawing upon. And second of all, when he translated it, some of it he mistranslated, and other aspects of it were incorrectly translated, not by any fault of his Sanskrit, but because he didn't have other Sanskrit texts or Tantric texts to compare with. Because the way these texts often work are with codified language that use really sophisticated referencing techniques. They can reference other texts, they can reference the Sanskrit language, they can reference other parts of the text, they can use analogies, they can use analogies that relate to well-known teachings of the time. And so what happened within this text that Arthur Avalon wrote was that he mistranslated some very fundamental aspects of the movement of Kundalini. And one of these was this idea of Kundalini entering through the door of Brahma. And the door of Brahma, when it's been looked back over by scholars who have references to multiple other texts, is actually at the crown. But Arthur Avalon, aka Sir John Woodruff, described it as being at the root. And so this entering of Kundalini that could only happen with the opening of Brahma's door was happening around the root center, making it fundamentally an incorrect teaching that has then been spread across the world and is part of many yoga traditions today in the modern era, and also a lot of discussion around what is Kundalini today. And it will all say that Kundalini is at the base of the spine or is at the bottom of the body and it's rising up. So there are a couple of issues there. We're working from a Hatha tradition which wasn't always supportive of Tantric ideals. We have this mistranslated text which then goes on to be a kind of huge phenomenon and influences yogis for the last 100 years. And so when you look up on Google, what is Kundalini, this is what you'll see. And this is what you'll find. and it's everywhere. Let's now go a little further back in time to the Tantric tradition, and let's understand how the Tantrikas described Kundalini. I want to begin by saying that Kundalini is a 5th century Tantric discovery, for want of a better word. Kundalini never featured in the Vedic corpus of texts. So Kundalini and its practices began and flourished and were a primary part of practice, were really the key to the Tantric practice. So the foundation really of all Tantric practice circles around Kundalini, this energy, and Kriya Yoga, which if you have time, I recommend, if you haven't already, watch over our previous lecture on what is Kriya Yoga. The term Kundalini first shows up in an early Tantric text called the Kalottara Tantra in the 6th century ACE. And this is where we start to see this idea of a power, Kundalini meaning a kind of power, Kundalini Shakti, as being part of the philosophy and practice. So through their practices, the Tantrikas realized over many hundreds of years, so they were probably starting to explore this kind of work around the time of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, so maybe 250 BCE, and over several hundred years. So it takes like 700 years before the first book that we know, that we have access to, is written. So it takes a long time for any practice within the Tantric tradition and also within the Vedic tradition to be written down. It's not like, oh, I have an idea of this cool new thing called Kundalini, I'm going to write a book about it, and I write a book and I become an instant master. It just didn't happen that way. It had to be tested over many generations and multiple cultures across the country before anything was written down. There had to be a certain level of, it's like testing, it's like peer-reviewed articles. It's the same thing that was going on in Tantra. And so the first article is written around that time, and it was realizing that through specific practices, there was an experience of energy that moved through the subtle body, which again had never been explored before in the Vedic texts. This power of working with the subtle body with this very specific energy, and it was this energy that created transcendence, awakening, and a kind of liberated awakening. This energy was called Kundalini Shakti, the coiled power of Shiva. Kundalini Shakti. This is the basis of transcendent practices within the Tantric tradition. What does the term Kundalini mean when we go back into the Tantric tradition? Because in Hatha, it's often described as, or in modern times, it's often described as a snake, almost like there is this internal snake inside of us, a coiled snake. Because Kundalini means coiled or spiraling shape. And so throughout the Tantric texts and then later in the Hatha texts, they would use analogies to describe this spiral. So the kundala was a kind of earring that was fashionable at the times, which you can still find kind of in different forms today. It's like a spiraling earring. You probably, if you go to a hippie shop, you'll find like a spiraling kind of silver earring with decorations on it. It was a kind of earring like that. That was the kundala, and that's where this term, this Kundalini, came from, this spiraling shape. But what has this spiraling shape got to do with Kundalini, the energy itself? Well, in Tantra, what they're trying to describe with Kundalini is this moment of fusion between inhale and exhale, where a kind of a power is created. And it's kind of like if you imagine a spring, if you got a big spring and you pushed it down, there's this power inherent in the spring that when you release it, the spring just pops up. So this is what Kundalini is. When we force two aspects of the breath together, like a hatha is a forcing. That's where this term actually comes back to. It's the forcing, the merging of the inhale and the exhale together. Then there is this moment of power that's created where we can start to call in Kundalini Shakti, work with our breath, and then allow it to kind of expand, to rise, to move through us. Within the Tantric tradition, the Kundalini first needed to be called down from above. And we're working with a complex system of Kriya Yoga, of Uchara practice. We work with specific breath counts, specific retentions of the breaths, and very specific mantras that would really call the Kundalini into the body and allow it to also move through the body as well. This was a very efficient system that was created in order to create massive energetic shifts within the practitioner, the sadhaka, the yogi. Take a moment to take a deep breath in now. And what I'd like you to do is hold the breath. Hold it a little longer. Start to feel this impulse build in you. A little bit of pressure is building. Hold a little longer. Just hold for one more beat longer. Feel it like a coil that's inside of you. And then when you release, sense it like the coil has released on your exhale. This is on the tiniest of scales, what this term Kundalini is referring to. By working with very specific practices, we can start to awaken a kind of coiled impulse, a power, a Shakti within ourselves. And this power is cosmic. There is a kind of a cosmic Kundalini, and then there is one that we can manifest on the macro scale within our body. This body temple can also manifest it as well. In Tantra, there was a calling down of Kundalini into the body, into specific chakras, not always the root chakra, as was described in the Hatha text, where it lays latent, always stuck in the root chakra. It was called down, and then it could rise from maybe the heart center or the navel center or the root center. It could rise from different parts of the body, and different traditions talked about it moving in different ways. So sometimes it would go into the heart and then back up to the third eye. Sometimes there were two energies drawing together. There is a sense that there was a mutable aspect across the traditions. So there wasn't one fixed rule. At the moment, this idea of Kundalini is very fixed. It's fixed at the base of the spine. That's the way it works. You've got to do certain practices to release it. It only rises up the spine. But when you come back to the ancient tantric understanding of what Kundalini is, and these were the people who spent thousands of years to do practices codifying how to work with Kundalini. These were the original Kundalini yogis. There is a sense that there is a mutability, a changeability. It's not fixed. It depends on the practice, depends particularly on your lineage and the way your teacher taught you. And there is a movement not just up, but there's also a movement down. Lastly, I just want to say this kind of final word of warning when it comes to working with Kundalini Shakti. The Kundalini Shakti is no joke. Even if we are only now talking about it in a quite esoteric way, in a way that is at the moment devoid of practices, there are very specific practices of awakening Kundalini within your body temple. These practices can create massive effects on your mind, your psyche, on your body, on your emotions. It's a very real experience that has been described across cultures, across lineages, described in great detail in the Tantric lineage, and is a big part of the yogic journey. So what I would say for anybody who's interested in kind of starting to awaken Kundalini Shakti as a part of their yoga practice in order to reach states of transcendence and awakening is go very slowly, go very carefully, and don't mess about with this energy on your own. It's really important to have guides, teachers who've had their own experiences, who understand the power, and who invite you to take a slow, steady, integrated approach. I mean, it can be really powerful to have a really strong, quick awakening, but it can be extremely discombobulating. I've had many students come to me after having powerful Kundalini awakenings, unable to kind of be in their daily life, unable to look after their kids, go to work. It can be very scary as well if you don't know what's happening. When I had a small Kundalini awakening about a decade or so ago, and it went for about 5 days. And the first day, I really didn't know what was happening. And only because I'd had a lot of training and I understood the nature of my energy body, I could kind of ease into the absolute magic of the experience, the beauty of the experience. But it can be really scary for some people if they don't know what is going on. So it's really important to have a guide, and it's really important that we allow these kinds of changes, if it is a Kundalini awakening, to be ones that are integrated into our life. So rather than kind of choosing to go for a really, like going really hard in some sort of yoga practice and having a really big experience and totally freaking out, like do it in a daily, gentle way. So this is like Shakti practice. Do it every day. Do it slowly, do it steadily, and then every time you can have these sort of Kundalini awakenings, they become integrated into your life. This integration aspect is how the Tantrikas perceive awakening. True liberation allows you to actually be in the world in an awakened state. You don't have to be in a hermitage or an ashram in the Himalayas in order to awaken. Doing things really slowly and making sure you have a proper guide. Thank you for this slightly longer lecture on Kundalini Shakti. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comment section below. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure that you watch over some of our other lectures on Kriya Yoga and the chakras. Thank you.